Hey everyone. Ever thought about how courts decide what's really fair when a couple splits up? Especially if one person's mostly been at home, you know?
Yeah, it's a tough one, right? Like, how do you put a value on that when you're dividing up their stuff?
Exactly. And that's what makes this case from Hong Kong, LKW VDD, back in 2010 so interesting. It really shook things up and changed how things work for divorces after that.
Yeah, it did. What's wild is that this case, which went all the way up to Hong Kong's highest court, the Court of Final Appeal, it kind of showed some big problems with how things were being done before.
Okay, so what was the old system like?
Well, for ages, the courts in Hong Kong used this idea of reasonable requirements to decide how to split assets in a divorce.
Reasonable requirements. That sounds kind of vague. What did that actually mean?
Basically, it meant figuring out like the bare minimum the person who had less money needed to live on. Just basic stuff, not really looking at splitting everything equally.
So let's say someone stayed home for years, supporting their partner's career, raising kids, that kind of thing. They might end up with way less.
Exactly. And that's where things got a bit messy. It often meant, the wife, for example, who'd been doing all that important work at home, ended up with a lot less, even though she was a huge part of everything.
Yeah, I see how that would feel super unfair.
Totally. And the LKWVDD case brought all that out into the open. It argued that this whole reasonable requirements thing, which came from an older case in 1990 called CVC, was outdated and didn't really fit with how we see fairness these days.
So this 2010 case was like, hang on, we need a new way of doing this.
Exactly. It was a turning point. The court decided to chuck out reasonable requirements and go with what's called equal sharing instead.
So aiming for a 50-50 split as the starting point.
Right. Now, that doesn't mean every divorce ends up exactly down the middle. It's more about setting a clear standard of what's fair. The judgment made it clear that equal sharing should be the default, unless there are really strong reasons to do something different.
So it's not like a hard and fast rule,
Yeah.
but it changes how we approach dividing things up, right?
Exactly. And one of the biggest things about this change is it acknowledges all those contributions that aren't about money.
So like the work a stay-at-home parent does is finally being taken seriously.
Yeah, and that's huge. It's about seeing a marriage as a real partnership where both people contribute in different ways, not just by bringing in a paycheck.
It sounds like a win for fairness for sure.
Absolutely. And to make things even clearer, the court laid out some key principles that should guide these kinds of decisions going forward. This is where LKW v. DD really set a new standard.
All right, so tell me about those principles. What changed for couples going through a divorce after this case?
Well, the biggest thing was that the court said fairness has to come first when you're deciding how to split things up. They were really clear that judges shouldn't discriminate based on those old-fashioned ideas about men's and women's roles in a marriage.
So no more assuming the person who earns more automatically gets more just because of that.
Right. The court basically said, look, we've got to start by recognizing that both people usually contribute to a marriage, even if those contributions look different.
That's a big shift, right? It changes the whole dynamic for a lot of couples.
It really does. And another important point was they said, no more of those super long, expensive investigations into every little detail of a couple's life. The kind that just drags things out and makes everything harder.
So no more arguing over who paid for more groceries or who did more chores.
Exactly. They shifted the focus to the big picture. What's a fair outcome overall, and how do we get there without getting stuck in all those little details?
Sounds like they were trying to make things more efficient, too.
For sure. They wanted to avoid situations where legal fees end up eating away at most of the assets they're arguing over.
So fairer and more practical. I like it.
And this is where it gets interesting for anyone thinking about divorce in Hong Kong. The LKW VDDD judgment didn't just lay out these principles. It gave some specific factors that courts should look at when deciding whether to move away from that equal sharing starting point.
Okay, so let's dive into those factors. When might equal sharing not be the final answer? What kind of things would make a court say, hold on, maybe we need to adjust things here?
So the judgment highlighted 5 key areas where a court might say, okay, maybe we need to move away from a straight 50-50 split. It's important to understand these aren't like automatic triggers. They're more like guidelines for the judges to think about what's fair.
Okay, makes sense. So what's the first area?
The first one is all about where the assets came from. Like, let's say one person brought something big into the marriage that they already owned before they even met their partner. Could be an inheritance, a family business, something like that.
So it matters what you had before you got married, not just what you built up together.
Exactly. The court realized it wouldn't always be fair to just split those premarital assets right down the middle, especially if the other spouse didn't really help grow them or anything.
Yeah, that
Yeah.
seems reasonable. What's next?
The second one is conduct. And this isn't about, who left the dishes in the sink. We're talking about more serious stuff. The judgment called it obvious and gross conduct.
Whoa, okay, that sounds intense. What kind of things are we talking about? Can you give me an example?
Sure, imagine one spouse gambled away a bunch of the family's savings or did something shady with money that hurt the other person. Things like that could definitely affect how the assets get divided.
So actions that really impact the couple's finances or their well-being.
Right. It's about recognizing that sometimes one person's actions or even inaction can create this imbalance that needs to be addressed when things go south.
Got it. Okay, so we've got the source of the assets and conduct. What's the third thing?
The third one is about financial needs and obligations. So, if one person has a lot more needs, maybe because they're the main caregiver for kids or they have a disability that needs ongoing support, the court might adjust things to make sure those needs are met.
So sometimes a straight 50-50 split just wouldn't be fair given what's going on.
Right. It's all about trying to make things truly equitable for both people.
Okay, 3 down, 2 to go.
Okay.
What were the last 2 the court mentioned?
The fourth one is how long the marriage lasted. A short marriage might be treated differently from a really long one when it comes to splitting things up.
That makes sense. I guess if you've built a life together for years and years, it's different from a couple who are only married for a short time.
Exactly. And the last one is contributions. This one is particularly interesting because it goes beyond just like who brought in how much money.
So we're talking things like taking care of the kids, managing the home, supporting your partner's work, all those things that don't have an obvious price tag.
You got it. The LKW VDD judgment was really clear that these contributions are super important to a marriage and should be factored in when dividing things up.
So finally giving credit where credit is due for things like being a stay-at-home parent.
Absolutely. But, and this is key, the court set a pretty high bar here. We're not talking about just being a good spouse or pulling your weight around the house. It has to be something truly exceptional that goes above and beyond the usual to justify moving away from that equal sharing starting point.
So no bonus points for just doing laundry or making dinner.
Right. It has to be something pretty significant. And this is a really important point to understand. The court stressed that these 5 factors are guidelines, not a strict formula.
So there's still some wiggle room for the judge to make a judgment call. It's not just checking boxes.
Right. It's about looking at the whole picture, considering all these things, and then making a decision that feels genuinely fair given the specifics of the case.
This is really helpful. I'm starting to see how courts in Hong Kong think about these decisions now.
That's the beauty of LKW VDD. It really set a new framework for how we approach fairness in these kinds of settlements.